Solon Levin. I'm director of the Studio for Creative Inquiry, the Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry. And today, as part of the Listening Spaces class, we're delighted to be able to offer a lecture by one of our visiting artists in residence. Her name is Abby Aresty. And so, just a brief word of explanation. I was contacted by the head of Phipps Conservatory recently. He said, we are having a guest artist who is creating a year-long piece of music for Phipps Conservatory, Botanical Gardens. And we're looking for a place where she could have a kind of a context nearby. And I said, bingo, that's us. So as part of our role here as the university's laboratory for experimental arts, we host atypical, interdisciplinary, and interinstitutional projects. And Abby's project of making a year-long piece of music for Phipps Conservatory fit perfectly. So for the last couple of months we've been hosting her. We hope to continue to do so pending more funding. And so at this point I won't give away any more about what Abby's working on. I'll just let her take it from here.
Well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here speaking with you. I think Golan said I'm a composer and sound artist. That's my background. And a year ago, I was installing a project in Seattle's Washington Park Arboretum. It was a really fun project, and it was a process. It took about a month to install the project. We were putting solar panels up high in trees, and once this part was done, once we had installed the project, I led a couple of public tours, and I would give my little spiel at the visitor center. We walked through 7 sites in the Arboretum, and silently. And on one of these tours, we reached the 3rd site, which is this. It's not the best picture, I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better picture, but it's this really tall tree with this small little crawl space where people could come in and sit and listen. It's geared more towards about 2 or 3 listeners, but there were 30 of us gathered around, listening very, very quietly to this, to these soft sounds that I introduced into the space. And while we were standing there, this kid walks by with his earbuds in, listening to his cell phone. And he looks at us, and we look bizarre, right? Because we're just 30 of us gathered around the tree, just standing there, and kind of pokes his head up to the front to see what we're looking at, figure out. Can't quite figure it out, and moves on his way. One of the reasons that I'm so interested in and excited to talk to this class is that this role of technology in shaping our listening experiences is very interesting to me. On the one hand, it allows us to creatively shape our sounds, our sonic background sort of throughout the day. On the other hand, it can create this disconnect between our oral, visual, and sonic experience of space. And it's a disconnect that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's a really interesting thing to me as an artist. So I want to, today I want to share a bit of my work, but I want to do so in the context of this question of the role of technology in shaping listening. So I've structured the talk in 3 sections. And the first is essentially sharing with you, and I know you have a whole semester to talk about this, but sharing with you my perspective on the role of technology in shaping listening. Then give a couple of influential works, examples of influential works that have shaped my thinking on the topic, and then of course share some of my creative work. So as listeners, in every experience of listening, there are 3 sort of things that shape our experience, which of course are the listener, the context, and the sound source itself. As listeners, we each bring our own unique sonic baggage, if you will, to our listening experience. So I come from a really small town, very, very quiet town. We didn't even have garbage trucks. And upon moving to Seattle in 2008, I had already lived in a couple of smallish cities, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Rochester, New York. But when I got to Seattle, I felt bombarded by sound. There were planes, garbage trucks, and baby crows, a pair of really obnoxious baby crows. Very cute, but obnoxious. And had I come from a different background, had I come from New York City, it may not have been so loud to me. But coming from Seattle, coming from Wayland, Massachusetts, a small town, it was pretty loud. Of course, we have a remarkable ability to adapt to our environments, right? So over time, it stops feeling so loud. We adjust to this new context, this new threshold. Sorry, I got lost Okay, connection there. So how is technology shaping our sonic baggage? Well, technology is shaping our sonic baggage in a lot of different ways, but in one way in particular I want to focus on, which is in creating this globalization of sound or homogenization of sound. So even though I had come from this background of a quieter space, it's not as if I had never experienced a car before, or a plane, or a garbage truck. All of this is something that we all share. So you can think of that as either, on the one hand, if you're thinking of it in more negative terms, it limits the background of our, the diversity of our perspective, sonic perspective. Or if you're more of a glass half full kind of person, you can think of it as a shared context, that we all share this sonic context. Okay, so speaking of context, there are a lot of different ways and things that I could share about this, but I want to focus on just one thing today, which is the difference between how we listen in public and private spaces. In particular, I want to talk about how, as listeners, we have agency in these different contexts. So in public spaces, our primary agency as listeners is in placing ourselves in space and time. So if you think, you're walking down the street, there's a big construction site, really loud, you can walk around it, or you can try to go earlier in the day. So your primary agency is in placing yourself in space and time. In private spaces, after you pick where you live, you're kind of fixed, right? You're stuck in this one location. So your primary agency is less reactive, it's more proactive. It's in shaping and building or composing your soundscape. So if you hear a loud noise, well, you might try to cover it up with fan noise or music, or you might ask your neighbors to tone it down, but you're essentially shaping rather than moving. Of course, technology has a huge impact on this, right? And I'm sure this is stuff that you're already talking about. And the big impact, really, as I see it, is in blurring the context, blurring the difference between these contexts. So in public spaces, now we can shape our own context, right? We can introduce mobile phones and listen to whatever we want, wherever we want. In private spaces, now we've got the internet. So we can't move our home, but we can virtually traverse all sorts of territory online and shape our spaces in that way. So as a side note, it's blurring the distinction between public and private spaces and listener agency in these spaces. But as a side note, it's also blurring the distinction between individual and communal listening, right? Because if we're at home by ourselves, we may be listening in a group to an online lecture, or if we're on the bus, we're surrounded by people, but listening to our own little earbuds, our own little world. So blurring that distinction as well. So we've talked about listener, right? We've talked about context, and the third element of this is the sound itself. And I'm sure, again, that you're talking about this, and I just want to give my perspective on it, which is, that the splitting of a sound from its source had a huge impact on how we understand sound. And of course, this is something that goes back many years. It's not a new technology. 1876 and 1877, we've got the telephone invention, Graham Bell, and then and the introduction of the phonograph. These are old technologies, but I won't go into a tangent of being a fly on the wall in that time period. Sorry, I get very excited about that. The splitting of the sound from its source has two main impacts that I think are worth discussing. The first is that we can introduce background music into any context, right? So we're most familiar with this in terms of Muzak company, an actual company which we think of as branding spaces. The second, which I know you've talked about or read about, is this idea of looking at a sound independently from any other element. So this concept of Pear-Schafer's reduced listening. So there are these two contrasting ways in which splitting the sound from the source is relevant. First is piping sound in, and second is thinking of sound just in terms of the sound itself. So regarding background music, although Muzak was founded in 1934, 14 years earlier, there's this composer Aresty, who's a French composer, and had this idea of composing sound for the background. He said it's going to be called furniture music. It's like furniture, it blends into the background. And so really at the time, I mean, it was, you know, he was a bit eccentric. It's an avant-garde idea, but now, of course, it seems like, you know, well, this is our daily lives. Already talked about music comedy, the way it sort of, we introduce sound into space to create these sonic identities for brands. What I think that does to us as listeners is, in a sense, it begins to dull our sense of listening, because we're not really intended to listen to this music, and so the more we tune things out, the less we listen to the spaces around us. Finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was John Cage. Have you talked about, or are you familiar with John Cage's piece of music, 4 minutes and 33 seconds? So I don't know if this was new to me. I mean, his piece was not new to me, but this background, a little tidbit, was new to me, which was that the first time he mentioned this idea for this piece was in 1947, and he said in the lecture, he was saying, I have this idea to compose a piece of interrupted silence and sell it on Muzak and Company. To Muzak and Company, it will be 3 or 4.5 minutes long, and it will be called Silent Prayer. Did you already talked about the music? Okay, because that was really new to me, that element of it. So this idea that this piece of music that was so influential in how, you know, as a composer, how I think about sound and using environmental sounds, had this slight background with Muzak. So Muzak was sort of inspirational in that way. Regarding this idea of listening to the sound itself, hopefully this won't do. It's very short. Okay, so this concept, that was a very, very short excerpt, the very, very beginning of a series of pieces that I have called Object Sound. And I played it here primarily to say that I'm not going to talk about reduced listening, because I know that you're going to be talking about that anyway, but just to say that it's really important to me as a composer. Ever since there are lots of different ways you can compose music on a computer. You don't have to use real sound, but using real sound has been really influential to me. It's something that I'm very interested in. And so I have this series of pieces called Object Sound, in which I'm exploring a single object. In that case, the squeaky green gloves on glass. And so in each piece, I actually unveil what the object is. I say what the object is, and then explore the sonic properties of that object. The last thing I want to touch on about, or the sort of how I want to frame this idea of reduced listening, rather than talking about that, I want to talk about this idea, this concept of multimodal listening, something that I've been introduced to very recently, and I'm sure that you haven't talked about it because it's part of an unpublished work. It's the dissertation of a student who was working, just graduated from University of Pittsburgh. And this disconnect that I was talking about at the beginning, she talks about this in her dissertation, and she talks about it in the context of well, she puts together this idea, this concept of multimodal listening, which is listening with all of our senses. To her, Schaefer's idea of reduced listening is all good and well, but it's ear-centric listening. And she's saying, okay, in order to really understand the full meaning, the full context of a sound, we really need to be in that space. We need to understand, you know, from visual. She interviews Evelyn Glennie, who's this deaf percussionist, and she, you know, talks about visual listening, physical listening, cultural meaning, all of that. So multimodal listening as sort of a counterpoint to this idea of reduced listening. So all of this stuff that I just kind of went through, and I know it was a lot very quickly, but I'm bringing it all up primarily to get back to this idea of disconnect. All of these things that I talked about, the listener and our sonic baggage and globalization, the way that sort of plays together, the context, the way we blur public spaces and the sound itself, the splitting of sound, and sort of all of these contribute to the disconnect that technology can introduce into our listening experiences. And we can talk about how I think that in more detail later if you like. So now I want to give just a couple examples of sound art that I think engages these issues, because while I think in everyday life technology can create this disconnect, I feel like one of the reasons the sound art is so powerful is because it has this opportunity to reconnect us through these interesting and unexpected listening experiences to our environments through sound. So talk about the same things. We'll talk about it backwards and regarding sound, the splitting of the source. I want to talk about this piece, City Links, and it's like the telematic performance. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then this piece, Auditory Tactics, to talk about the context. And finally, one of my favorite works, Christina Kubish's Electrical Walks. We'll talk about that in terms of listener, but also a little bit in terms of context. Okay, so this is, and I believe this is Marianne Amacher, and she's a sound artist. She recently passed away, I think it was 2009. And her piece, City Links, which was first realized in 1967, but it's a sort of a series of pieces that she's done over time. And it's this piece in which she'll take live mics, put them in either different cities, most often, or sometimes around the same city, and pipe that sound live back into a gallery, right? So, and this is an example of a telematic performance, using telephones or telephone lines to allow people or places in this case, in different places to interact in the same place. So she was interested in this idea of synchronicity, all these different things that happen at the same time in these different places, and being able to experience them in the gallery space. I'm interested in her work for two reasons. The first is, that's her synchronicity. The first is this concept of heterotopias, of being able to experience multiple spaces in one real space. This is a concept by Foucault, and it's interesting, the same time he was making this piece, independently, he was talking about and lecturing about this concept of heterotopias. And so heterotopias, this idea of multiple spaces in one real space, is very important to my work. In relation to what we were talking about before, the splitting of the sound from the source, just to point out very briefly, in Muzak, we're piping the sound, right, into a place. Here, what she's doing is quite the opposite. She's taking sound, environmental sounds, and bringing it into a gallery space and saying, no, listen to this. It's actually really interesting. It's really important. And so she's allowing us to reconnect sonically to these spaces and engage with them in this sort of more important level because we're bringing into this gallery space. So regarding context, there's this piece by, I just call them the Philippes because my French is horrible. So this piece by these two artists, Auditory Tactics, in which they introduce sound via these parametric speaker arrays. So they're basically all they're doing is making really hyper-directional sound, so that if you're standing to one side of it, you're not going to hear, well, ideally, if the technology works perfectly, you're not going to hear what's coming out of that speaker. Whereas if you're standing in front of it, or you're standing directly in front of a reflection of that sound, you'll hear what's coming out of it. And so what they did is they introduced these speakers into space, and they were interested in creating these private listening spaces in a public context. And of course, we already talked about how we can do that via headphones, but this is really different when you have it out in the world, when people can experience this communally and can, in a way that makes them engage with the space. They created, part of it was this whispering wall that you'd only hear as you walk by in a certain location. So this was something that was interesting to me, thinking of these auditory tactics. Give a little other piece.
My name is Christina Kubisch. I'm a sound artist, and I'm here invited by the Danish Arts Council for a short residency. I am here because I have created an electrical work. It's a ongoing work in progress, and it's about hearing and discovering the hidden electromagnetic sounds of the city. So they become musicians, they become like a mixer, they become someone who participates in the whole process, and the more they're active, the more I think the work is nice for them too.
Okay. But I love that she's like jamming out to that. It's a very, very cool piece. To me, this piece was incredibly influential. I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty awesome. So it's Christina, as you know, Christina Kugisha's Electrical Walks. And, there's so much, there's so much I could talk about here, but first, I guess, the main thing to think about is, which way do I want to go, sorry, is this idea of context, right? So they're listening to these headphones that she made, and they're engaging with this space in a sense, it's this private world, right, that we have with our earbuds and whatever. But on the other hand, it's a communal listening experience, right, because everybody around them that has these headphones is engaging in this same interesting sonic experience. The other thing, and probably in some ways the more important element for me, was this idea of listener agency. She's giving people, basically, she gives people these maps and lets them wander around and create their own piece, which is a pretty profound thing to do as an artist, she's essentially saying, you know, these individuals that are experiencing my piece, they're shaping their own pieces, they're creating their own works, in a sense. So that idea of listener agency was really, really important to me. Regarding this idea of the listener, I talked about at the beginning, and this is just one side note. When she first started these pieces, she actually was creating her own soundscapes. She would use electromagnetic fields, and she'd build these up and let people wander around, and she created this. This was, I think in the 70s. She went away from it many years, came back to these headphones, put them on, and suddenly, whereas before she had this space, it was quiet, she had this space, she could create her own compositions. She came back, and suddenly the space was filled with sounds, right? Suddenly these sounds were already there. So it's this globalization of invisible sound, right, that she's engaging, she's tapping into as part of her work. So I think that that's a pretty profound thing. And I think it's pretty profound too because when you take those headphones off, you still are experiencing that piece. You're still knowing that the sound is surrounding you in a way that you weren't able to engage with prior to that experience. So I think it's a pretty powerful work. So while technology can create in some ways this disconnect between our sonic, visual, and physical experience in space, I think that sound art is really interesting in the ways in which it can engage some of these very same issues to create more of a connection. And so that's sort of how I frame my work, what interests me in my own work. So I'll play a little sample for you. Just an example. So that's an old work, and I play it, really, it's Piercing the Veil of Carinas, which is, I wrote in 2007. It's a piece for flute, doubling on bass flute, piccolo, and electronics. Now, all of the electronics are composed with flute sounds. So it's all created from sounds of my friend Daria improvising on the flute, and then I recorded them and transformed them. And I play it really primarily just as a way to give you a little bit of context. It's not the entire piece. It's about 2 minutes of a 12-minute piece. That's like the pretty part, and then it gets really intense. So anyway, just by way of giving you a bit of context, the pieces that I want to talk about are Paths 2, the piece that I introduced very briefly in the beginning, and this project that I'm here to work on, of Earth and Sun. So Paths 2, this piece that I did last year for the Seattle Washington Park Arboretum, that was my very first piece of site-specific sound art. It also happened to be my dissertation. And so as you see, my background was in writing concert music, and I was used to knowing my audience. You know, usually there are about 10 people in the hall, and so you literally know your audience because it's all contemporary classical music and nobody really shows up. So you know the background, you know the people, and you know that you all share the same framework. Now I was writing this piece for this public environment where on the one hand it was my dissertation and I needed to satisfy my dissertation committee, and on the other hand I was writing for people who might have no framework for what they were about to experience. And so I was a little bit terrified about this idea of trying to balance these different needs of these different groups of people. And the way in which I ultimately balanced these needs, or at least attempted to balance these needs, was by engaging with these issues. This is, gets back to everything that we were talking about, thinking about spending time in the Arboretum, reflecting on the listener, the context, and the sound, all of these elements. So regarding the listeners, so we've got my dissertation committee, we've got the general public. Well, their background in terms of music and sound are totally different, right? But they have this shared framework of Seattle's soundscape, right? And so there was this familiar context that I could draw from. And once something becomes familiar, you kind of stop listening to it, right? So I was interested in finding ways to re-engage them with this space, and I did that by introducing sort of unexpected sounds in the space. Pretty standard for sound art, right? And I also did that by telling them, okay, these sounds, they're unexpected, unusual, but they're created from sounds gathered at the site, and I want you to listen to them in the context of all of the sounds that surround them. So I'm not only putting this there, but I'm actually just saying it. I'm just saying, please listen to this in the context of everything that you're hearing. It's not just about this piece, it's about this piece in relationship to everything else around it. And so, yeah, just telling them that. So regarding the context, as I said, I spent a lot of time listening and observing in the Arboretum in preparation for the piece, and although it's a public space, people of course engage with it in this private way, either through earbuds or in private conversations, that sort of thing. So I was interested in creating more of a communal listening experience. I was also, again, really interested in this idea of listener agency. As a composer, I was tired of the concert hall, right? Because in the concert hall, I'm putting forth this piece, I'm structuring time for the listener, and maybe the performer structures the time as well, but that's it. Everything else is, people come in, they sit down, they listen, and they all have the same experience. And I was really tired of that. So I was really interested and excited by this idea of, okay, I'm going to have these 7 sites in the Arboretum, I'm going to spread the sound around, and I'm going to give them a map. The maps didn't really help that much in the Arboretum, unfortunately. But I'm going to let them, wander around, experience the piece in their own way. And so when they stop, when they move around, they're shaping their own sense of time. And so obviously Kubish and many others have been interested in this. The other thing that I was really interested in, and one of the main inspirations for this piece, was this idea of soundscape. And I wanted to introduce this earlier, but a soundscape is essentially the sounds of an immersive environment considered as a whole. And the soundscape of the Arboretum had all of these competing sounds. We had man-made sounds, people just talking, laughing, whatever, but we had machine noise, leaf blowers, and traffic and air noise, airplanes, and we had bees and the girdling and all that, all juxtaposed and all kind of in opposition. And so what I was interested in doing was introducing this layer of sound that would serve, in a sense, as a bridge between all these different worlds. So I was saying, okay, I'm going to introduce this layer of sound composed from sounds in the space that will create this relationship and allow people to experience all of these different levels of the soundscape in relationship to one another. So as I said, sounds that I used were all recorded on site, and it was interesting because for each site I picked essentially one sound to work with. So at one site it was the sound of squirrels rustling in leaves, at another site it was rain, and then I composed, kind of like my object sound piece, I composed with just that sound. So I was interested in the aesthetic of the sound itself. But I was also giving people this narrative because I told them in these little maps, I told them what this sound was. So they were getting this narrative of my experience recording these sounds. And so it's not completely, so it's reduced listening, but it's not completely acousmatic listening, right? And not splitting the sound off from its source. So the other thing, so when we talked about sound, we talked about splitting sound from the source, and we talked about that in terms of reduced listening, but we also talked about it in terms of music, in terms of piping sound back into the space. Well, I was piping sound back into the space, and unfortunately I had to figure out how to do it myself, so I could build these solar-powered sound distribution systems that we brought back to the space. But I was doing this hopefully in a way that rather than kind of just branding the space and dulling people's listening senses, hopefully just by telling people to listen and explaining this contextual framework, it was engaging people not only with the sound itself that they heard, but also with the sounds of the space. So, play just a little bit of this. Squirrels rustling through the tree. From gurgling water. One more thing. This is the set I was describing at the beginning. It was made from the lawnmower transitioning to rain. doing right now is, this was right next to the fourth site, which is all created from random. So we can walk right around the corner of that. Okay, you know, there's one more thing, but this one's really fun. It was a fly that landed on a contact microphone, so it's all like the sound of its legs. Okay, anyway. So, we can stop there. Okay, so that piece, which was 7 sites in the Arboretum, directly led to this opportunity to come here to work on this project for the Center for Sustainable Landscape. So it's for FIPS, but if you know they're building their new office building, or if you're familiar with the Center for Sustainable Landscape, it's a really green office building. So while I was with the plants, and everybody seems to make this mistake, I am not with the plants anymore. I am now in an office building inside. So very, very different experience, very different site to work with. So I came in February, experienced the site, and I learned a lot about the difference between sort of traditional buildings and what they're trying to do there. And this is inspirational to the piece. So traditional buildings isolate people from their environments. So you know, I've been in here actually and not realized that it's raining outside, that sort of thing. And of course they drain natural resources, whereas the Center for Sustainable Landscapes, the goal is to reconnect people with their environment. And of course, it's a very sustainable building, so harnessing these elements, the natural elements, to sustain it. And so those two things were the sort of inspiration for the initial ideas behind my project, my idea for my project, which is this project called Earth and Sun. It comes from this Frank-Ratchye quotation, buildings to our children of Earth and Sun. And the goal was to, first of all, reconnect people with their environment, and decided to do this by composing with environmental sounds. So, but rather than just sounds around the site, I decided, for some reason, sounds all around Pittsburgh. And I don't have a car, and so I've been biking around town, you know, trying to record all of these sounds for the past couple of months. I also wanted to focus on this idea of sustainability and find a way to sort of convey that to the people who are experiencing this sort of poetry of sustainable design. And I decided to do that by making the same way the building responds to its weather. The windows open automatically, you know, and close automatically depending on the weather. We harness the wind, the sun, all of that. I wanted my installation to be responsive to the weather and the seasons and the time of day. And so that's the ultimate goal for the ultimate project. Right now, if you go over there, you can actually hear a temporary installation, which isn't quite nearly as cool. It doesn't respond to the weather and whatnot, but it's this fixed 20, well, it's supposed to be 24 minutes, ended up being like a little 25, reflecting a day in the life of Pittsburgh soundscape, composed from all over. So, recording, composing, editing sound. In working on this piece, I've had a lot of time to spend long nights in the Center for Sustainable Landscapes, stay there overnight, and listen and experience the space, and it's brought me to think of a couple of new ideas related to the project. So the underlying framework is still the same, but whereas when I started, I figured I would just process sound like I always do. Now I'm working with sounds that are not processed at all, which is actually, at all. Basically not processed at all. So you know what they are. You hear cricket, you know it's a cricket.